Welcome to the first episode of Quintessential Conversations. Quintessential Conversations is our CAS project. CAS stands for Creativity, Activity and Service, which is a core component of the IB diploma. In this first episode, we are going to explore the impact of climate change on ecological equilibrium. As our guest, we have Professor John Mathew, an associate professor of the history of science and medicine at Krea University, India. Hope you all enjoy.
Okay. So the current definition of ecological equilibrium is to maintain a state of dynamic balance of organisms in which diversity remains stable and gradually progresses through natural selection. Will this definition of ecological equilibrium change with the existing extraordinary speed of climate change?
My hunch is yes. To some extent, I'll say that largely because we've, as you pointed out, this is unprecedented. But there is a caveat, and that is that there have been mass extinctions in time past. The difference, of course, is that we've never had a situation where one species is disproportionately responsible for the kind of losses that we're seeing. When I talk about mass extinctions, I draw reference to the Permian Triassic of about 250 to 255 million years ago, where you had something like 90 to 95% of all species going. I mean, of large species, we still don't know about bacteria and viruses and the like, but groups like the ammonites were hit hard, and there were elements like that. Similarly, when you come to the KT boundary, the Cretaceous Tertiary, or what's known, or a part of the Tertiary, which is known as the Paleogene, or the Cretaceous Paleogene, which is about 65 million years ago, you have the dinosaurs going out in the main, and with the Permian Triassic, it was largely anoxic situations where oxygen was really reduced in many ways. In this case, the argument is it was a bolide, a meteorite that was hitting, and so that happened. But those were in terms of millions of years, right? Over here, we're seeing things that are happening in an alarmingly short period of time, and that's a concern. The question, of course, is whether equilibrium will be reached, and the notion of equilibrium itself is ecological, and I recall Frederick Clements actually come up with the notion of disclimaxes and proclimaxes and edaphic climaxes and climactic climaxes. But the point is, at any particular juncture, equilibrium is being reached, and then you move from that equilibrium to another. But is it that something can stay where it is? The answer is yes. Is there a certain level of dynamism? Yes, because you wouldn't move from one equilibrium to another if there weren't everything being irenic and joyful at that point in time. So I suspect that there will be dramatic changes. What it will betoken for the life of the planet, it's hard to say. It may have very deleterious effects for us, which from a planetary perspective may not be such a bad thing.
Climate change is a continuing process that has been happening since millennia. However, climate change from a human perspective is thought to be detrimental. This is the most common approach to climate change. Is there any possibility of this climate change being beneficial to other species or ecosystems?
Taking on from the question of equilibrium being reached, I think that, and let's take one thing, let's take competition, right? So competition is eventually going to be, well, it's not necessarily, it could be advantageous to one species or one group or one community to the detriment of others. Of course, there are situations where both end up doing pretty badly, and we're not talking about that. If we were to look at positions of equilibria and as I said, climaxes of various kinds of, in an ecological sense, you do get pioneer species, right? Because if suppose, say for example, with the KT boundary, going back to that, what did the destruction of, or the extinction of the dinosaurs do? It ushered in possibilities for mammals, right? And that's why we have the number of mammals we have. It's not like reptiles have done particularly badly. We still have a lot of snakes and lizards and crocodiles and turtles and tortoises, but it's not like we're necessarily juicing for space with them, you know, in many ways. And excuse me. So if humans were to get to particular places, we have a certain say in how things are changing, and it is possible that there could be unforeseen circumstances. Suppose things were to warm in particular places. Certain species might do better than others because it's hitting their optimal temperatures and they might do well. Is that going to be an equilibrium of a particular kind? It could be reached. Will it stay there? Unlikely, right? And so in the short term, perhaps, I mean, I can see as if things were to get colder, do you see chrysotine rodents moving in a particular direction or not, you know, for example? Would there be more weedy species getting across and traveling potentially? These are true, but then these are drops in the ocean of biodiversity, right? And sometimes when you see particular species, you realize that it's more a question of the degradation of the environment rather than an improvement on it. But the other point here is how long-standing will the effect of humans be in terms of climate change? Will it be because we've clear-cut so many of our trees, particularly in tropical areas where you have so much more of the resource in the tree than in the soil, unlike temperate areas, that there is a point of no return, at least for those particular, so those become questions that are worth considering. Would there be, and dystopic movies talk to this all the time, the danger of a nuclear fallout? And if that happens, and if that were to occur, then who's to say? Because we haven't actually encountered that situation yet, save for what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And if that in microcosm is what could occur, then God help us, right? Because because that happened in 1945, and nuclear capability has only increased significantly since. So there's that. I mean, against that, of course, is a notion and I think I mentioned before about weather versus climate. And like you say, one swallow does not make a summer. It is possible that sometimes we might overestimate our own capabilities. That doesn't mean that we should be complacent, but I think we should fall somewhere between being concerned and being pragmatic.
So we sometimes forget that humans are a part of the ecosystems, and we depend on our ecosystems and the food chains to survive. So how climate change drastically affect the way we procure the basic necessities of our ecosystems from our ecosystems?
Well, if we're looking at it from the point of view of a straight food chain, the worry, of course, is if it were simply a single herbaceous base to a single herbivore prey base to another, then it would be worrisome. It would be less of a concern if you had options. So it is much more of a food web. So the question is, do you simply change your dietary preferences if you could? Now, it's interesting, right? If you look at evolution, in order to optimize particular circumstances, you may be extremely restricted in what you eat. So, and in ecology, you use terms like obligate versus facultative. If you're facultative, it means that you can eat across the board. I mean, yeah, sure, I can have a plum and I can have an apple and I can do whatever. But there are others, like, I mean, there is, what is it? I'm trying to think of Aristolochia, Pachyopta Aristolochia, which is the common rose. It's a swallowtail butterfly. And it goes almost exclusively to this plant called Aristolochia indica. And it sequesters cardinalides in its body, which makes it immediately toxic or episomatic, which is, I mean, distasteful to other predators. Now, if Aristolochia indica were to go out, one wonders what will happen to the butterfly that depends upon it, right? So that's a particular case where you're locked into that particular system. It has significant benefits if you have it, but it's dicey in that sense. If, on the other hand, you did have these options, it would be less of a concern because you're being, as they in the original use of the word, more Catholic in your choices, right? And I think that's where possibilities really exist. I think, I'd mentioned this, right? I think, which is, I'm trying to remember where there was this wager taken between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, and one of them was an alarmist ecologist, and the other was an economist, and they looked at 5 elements, and they asked whether the price of it over the space of a decade would decrease or increase. The ecologist was convinced it would increase because the supply would be less. And the economist said, no, it would actually drop in the face of potentially other choices. And the economist eventually won the wager. Now, what this may imply for limited resources could be worrisome in some senses, because the economists, I mean, if they can't, I mean, there were a series of reasons why he won, but but if one were to take that as gospel, then you'll say we'll always find another way. And again, the danger of complacency creeping into the equation becomes very real. And if that were true, then this could be ultimately to our peril. And that's a larger concern. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And Professor, as you mentioned, because our resources do not come from just one ecosystem, they do come from more than one ecosystem. And when we juxtapose it against a grander scale, say the biosphere, humans are a very tiny proportion of that biosphere. We just make up a tiny fraction of it. And yet most of the solution to combat climate change, such as becoming carbon neutral, are again modeled on the very behavior and on the very needs of humans. And sometimes we forget that climate change is actually vastly disproportionate. The effect is having largely disproportionate to other ecosystems. So how do we achieve holistic solutions and accommodate other species and ecosystems into the solutions proposed to climate change?
It's a tough one. I think, well, from the point of view of the biosphere, yeah, I mean, that would include absolutely everything across ecosystems, but there is no one size fits all, right? I mean, and what conduces for someone living in equatorial Africa is going to be quite different from someone living in Nunavut in Canada. right? And first of all, the ecotypes are different. The range of temperature variation is going to be different. You already have developed, even within the same species, particular coping mechanisms, right? And the notion, and this is, in English terms, I mean, it might sound a little pejorative, but the notion of the noble savage, you probably heard this, is one where individuals of the community live in consonance with their environment. So to take the Gandhian idea, if the world is enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed, the suggestion is with the noble savage, the notion of need is really being upheld and greed simply doesn't apply. Now, the notion of the noble savage itself has been criticized on the basis that if there had been greater technology, would humans be humans, and would you just would you run into the tragedy of the commons again, and would you essentially try to maximize personal benefit and damn the rest? I mean, so there is that aspect to it. And was it that you remained frugal and you remained essentially restrained simply because you didn't have the technology? So that's a counter argument in some senses. But I would say, however, that if you were to take the Gandhi notion of there not being enough for everyone's greed, then we're in a difficult place, because it's not merely other species, it's also individuals of our own species that belong to the realm of the have-nots, right? So, and their selfishness could come to the fore. So, I think in some senses, the danger would lie as much over there. So, I mean, even as you move towards elements of being carbon neutral, again, come back to the tragedy of commons. Is everybody playing by those rules? If you have George W. Bush not signing on to Agenda 21 back, not George W. H.W. Bush, the father, right? With the Rio Conference in 1992, if you have Trump walking out of the Paris Accords, although Biden says he's going back, if these happen, right? If the United States could not ratify the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, if you have these situations, then it means that it isn't a level playing field. So the point over here is not to make a monolith of humankind. Which humans? And which humans have a disproportionate influence within a species that in itself exerts a disproportionate influence upon the planet. So there are degrees of this, right? So, yeah. Other questions?
Ecosystems can be particularly vulnerable to climate change, which is happening over a short period of time. There have also been abrupt changes in the past, but the rate of change in the current era is expected to be both global and rapid. Will the transition between the current ecological equilibrium and the next ecological equilibrium be more disorderly and stressful to the environment?
Potentially. And part of that is because we might be hitting the kind of temperatures that we haven't seen before. And we've spoken about the Keeling curve, where you just see how this goes up from the 1950s, and Charles Keeling actually doing this in Mauna Loa and in Hawaii, and looking at how temperatures are rising. We are at this phase, and you know of it, where we're talking about the Anthropocene, and the question that is often posed is, where do you date the Anthropocene? Is it coincident with the Holocene, which is the latest of the epochs? They come from the Paleocene onwards, right? It's from about 13,000 years ago, or 11,000 BC, which is really the dawn of sedentary life with agriculture. Or do you set it with the great empires of the Greeks and the Romans, or do you have it with the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, or with the baby boom in the 1950s. And you can make a case for the golden spike being placed at any of these, right? And the changes accordingly. But the key thing is that you need to have something stratigraphic to say that this exists. You can say, yes, this is what happens. There were major temperature changes. Do we have these statistically? What is the geostratigraphic element that we can use that marks the Anthropocene, if it is not the Holocene, right? To distinguish it from it, and Anthropos, human, right? And human generated in this particular case. Is there something that in time can be recognized, or will it be merely a blip? And is it only because we were narcissistic that we decided that we need to call it this, right? And time will tell. I think I mentioned the sixth extinction, and this is worth looking at one point, I think. And there's this one chapter called "Welcome to the Anthropocene." Yes, and it's worth looking at. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. The other, I mean, the other place, of course, is where you put this, and I mentioned dystopic movies and all that, but where literature, the arts are really responding to these in many places. The one person who's done this a lot has been Amitav Ghosh, the writer who wrote The Hungry Tide, and most recently Gun Island. But otherwise, he's written The Great Derangement. And one of the questions he asks is whether people in literature have actually been responding to scientific observations and worries. And he's taken on the challenge himself, which I think is admirable, and plaudits and props to him in that regard. And I think that's true. I mean, Dipesh Chakrabarty has written 4 theses where you're looking at climate change from the point of view of the humanities and social sciences. And one of the questions is, should we elide the difference between the human and the natural? And should we start looking at this as part of a continuum? And so I recommend that particular article. If you don't have it, ask me. I'll be happy to send it to you. Yeah.
I think that's all the questions we have for you, Professor. But any suggestions which you want to make, or any comments that you have?
No, it's wonderful that you're doing this, and I commend you for following through, and I hope it will be of benefit to your auditors. And if they've got any questions, please feel free to ask them to get in touch directly. You're welcome to share my e-address and number, and whoever would like to talk to me, and that will be there. How many of these do you have per year? These podcasts?
This year, we are looking at, say, January to June, 2 per month.
Mm-hmm.
So we are looking at around 12 this year. And then next year, we're not going to do this. But the next year later, 2023, we are again looking forward to catching up on these podcasts.
Lovely. And and what will you do next year? What happens in the interlude?
Well, it's boards, so there'll be a lot of
but then won't your succeeding class do it?
No, this is our
conducting their own projects. This is like our project that we conduct.
But then
it's kind of like our project, and then the people that are going to be in 11th next year will be doing their own projects.
Right. So therefore, the 3 of you will be curating all of the podcasts. Lovely. What are some of the other topics with which you're dealing?
Well, for next week, we have Dr. Kshitij Aras, who is working with the National Law School as a policy management. And he is going to be talking about navigating local solutions to global crises like climate change. So after that, for next month, February, we have gender equality. For March, we have reduced inequalities. And for April, we have good health and well-being because April 7th is World Health Day. And for the last one in May, we are going to have peace, justice, and strong institutions. So
Well,
this is our broad range of topics. And again, coming back to the very topic of Anthropocene, we're also doing articles. So right now, we're writing an article called Frontiers of Climate Change, Anthropocene-Induced Climate Change. So we are trying to look at how different is the current epoch from Holocene, and why many people do not believe that we're still in an ice age. We're just in the latter part of the ice age because there's still ice on Earth, in Antarctic and the Arctic, and how the Milankovitch cycles of Earth and how that affects the natural sort of progression of climate change, and how Anthropocene-induced climate change is sort of exacerbating the entire natural set time cycle.
that's fascinating. Oh, I would like to see this. If you have articles ever done, so that'd be good.
We can send you the website after
That'd be good.
we put up the article. Yeah.
That'd be brilliant. You did get what I sent. Thank you for your e-message, Rajna. The plays that are being done on climate change. Did I send it to all of you or just to you, Rajna? I don't know. I sent it to all of you, right?
I actually sent it to all of them. I just, yeah, I did forward them.
Yeah, but you followed up, yeah. So I thought the timing was pretty remarkable, right? That they're doing this at just about the time that you're doing climate change. So hopefully you'll get a chance to register. I know you have, Sujana, but hopefully the others, if you haven't, have the time, hopefully you'll give it a bit of a look. That'd be grand. Yeah. Well, all the very best with all of this. It's very good to see you again, and
thank you.
A pleasure. And yeah, stay in touch and let me know how you're all doing. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
An absolute pleasure. See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Check for the recording now.